If you want to know if a person is truly loyal, my fiancé Marcus used to say, you have to test them. For 3 years, I was his subject. He'd disappear for 24 hours to test my patience or criticize my appearance to test my self-esteem. As a teacher, I was trained to observe patterns, and I saw exactly what he was doing. I wasn't his partner. I was his project. But I stayed. I waited. I watched. Then came the text that was meant to be the final blow. I have someone else now. We should break up. Please vacate by Friday. No apology. No explanation. Just a clinical termination of our entire life together. He expected the usual script: my tears, my begging, 100 missed calls of desperation. But Marcus made one fatal mistake. He forgot that teachers don't just observe, they grade. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply sent one short, polite line back. And 5 minutes later, his phone didn't just ring, it exploded. His carefully constructed world of lies began to audibly shatter. Tonight, I am taking you inside a story of betrayal that goes far deeper than a simple affair. You are about to witness how a quiet teacher used Marcus's own psychological games to trigger a professional and social audit he never saw coming. Stick around until the very end, because the way his tests eventually backfired, costing him his career, his reputation, and his dignity, is the ultimate masterclass in satisfaction. If someone keeps testing your worth, it's time to show them exactly what happens when they finally fail the exam. My name is Laura, and at 52 years old, I have spent nearly 3 decades in the classroom as a high school English teacher in a quiet suburb of Connecticut. I have dedicated my life to helping teenagers find their voices and understand the nuances of human nature through literature, never imagining that I would one day have to apply those same analytical skills to save my own soul from a man I intended to marry. For 28 years, I was the woman people turned to for stability and wisdom, the one who could spot a troubled student's cry for help from across a crowded hallway. Yet I somehow found myself entangled with Marcus, a man who viewed love not as a sanctuary, but as a laboratory. Marcus was a highly successful tax consultant, a man whose life was built on the precision of numbers and the strict adherence to codes. When we first met, I found his meticulous nature comforting, mistaking his desire for order as a sign of a disciplined, reliable partner. However, as our engagement progressed, the comfort curdled into something far more sinister. It began with what he called marriage preparation, a series of orchestrated scenarios designed, he claimed, to ensure we were compatible under pressure. He had a chillingly calm way of explaining these moments, often referring to them as tests of my character or my resilience. In the beginning, I fell for the trap, believing that if I just showed enough patience or proved my loyalty, we would eventually reach the finish line of a happy, stable marriage. But as a veteran educator, I am trained to look for patterns, and the patterns I began to see in Marcus were profoundly disturbing. I started to notice a direct correlation between my professional triumphs and his sudden need to test me. The night I was honored as Teacher of the Year, a night that should have been a pinnacle of my career, Marcus managed to leave me stranded at the gala. He claimed he had an emergency client call and simply disappeared, leaving me to find my own way home in an evening gown, clutching my award in the back seat of a cold rideshare. When I finally walked through the door, he didn't offer an apology. Instead, he looked at me with a clinical detachment and said he wanted to see how I handled unexpected shifts in priority. He told me that a good wife needs to be able to stand on her own feet without becoming hysterical when her husband is busy. It happened again when I successfully navigated a difficult parent-teacher conflict that had been weighing on the school board. That evening, Marcus sat me down and spent 2 hours meticulously criticizing a meal I had cooked, a recipe he had previously praised. He dissected the seasoning and the presentation as if he were auditing a tax return, eventually concluding that my lack of attention to detail at home was a worrying sign for our future together. He called it a test of my humility. Through my teacher's lens, however, the red ink was beginning to cover the page. I realized these weren't random acts of selfishness. They were tactical strikes. Marcus wasn't trying to build a marriage. He was trying to erode my self-worth so that he could maintain total control. He needed me to doubt my own excellence so that his approval became the only currency that mattered. Instead of lashing out or succumbing to the tears he seemed to expect, I fell back on my professional instincts. If Marcus wanted to treat our relationship like a case study, I would provide the documentation. I began a mental log which eventually transitioned into a physical journal kept hidden in my school desk. I documented everything. I recorded the dates, the specific triggers, his tone of voice, and the exact phrases he used to flip the script. When he would tell me I was too sensitive or remembering things wrong, I would simply go back to my notes and confirm the reality he was trying to erase. I treated his behavior like a classroom behavioral plan, stripping away the emotion to look at the raw data of his manipulation. I watched how he used silence as a weapon and how he used praise like a carrot on a stick, always pulling it away just as I reached for it. The final shift in my perspective came during what he intended to be his most grueling test yet. Following a minor disagreement about our wedding guest list, Marcus initiated a 24-hour period of total silence. He stayed in the house, moved through the rooms like a ghost, and looked right through me as if I didn't exist. In the past, this would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety hovering around him and apologizing for things I hadn't done just to break the tension. But this time, I sat in the living room with a book watching him. I observed the way he checked the corners of his eyes to see if I was crying. I noticed the deliberate way he set his coffee mug down to make just enough noise to be noticed, but not enough to be called out. In that silence, I experienced a chilling moment of clarity that changed everything. I realized that Marcus wasn't actually afraid of losing me. He wasn't worried that his behavior would drive me away. What he truly feared was the moment I realized I didn't need his approval to be whole. He was a small man who needed a large shadow, and he had been using me to cast it. The pain that had been simmering in my chest for months suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp, and professional clarity. I stopped trying to pass his tests. I stopped trying to prove I was the perfect fiancé. I moved from being the subject of his experiment to being the auditor of his failures. I stayed in the house, I remained polite, and I continued our routine, but I was no longer a participant in his games. I was simply a witness waiting for the inevitable moment when his arrogance would finally outrun his intellect. I felt a strange sense of peace, the kind you feel when you've finally finished grading a stack of papers and you know exactly who has failed the course. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in years, completely unaware that the end was moving toward me faster than I could have imagined. And then, on a Tuesday morning that seemed entirely ordinary, the text message that was meant to shatter my world finally arrived. The Tuesday morning sun was streaming through the kitchen window, casting long, sharp shadows across the granite island where I sat with my second cup of coffee. I was mentally preparing for a lesson on Faye Scott Fitzgerald's use of symbolism when my phone vibrated against the counter with a jarring metallic buzz. I picked it up expecting a message from a colleague or a student's parent, but instead I found a text from Marcus. It was 3 sentences long. I have someone else. We should break up. Please vacate by Friday. There was no preamble, no mention of the 3 years we had spent building a life together, and certainly no apology for the engagement ring that still sat on my finger. It was a corporate termination, a cold administrative dismissal of a woman he had spent months trying to break. Marcus dealt in audits and spreadsheets, and it was clear that in his internal ledger I had been moved from an asset to a liability that needed to be written off before the weekend. He treated our relationship like an expired contract, assuming that the clinical cruelty of the delivery would be the ultimate test to finally shatter my composure. He wanted to see me unravel. He wanted to hear the frantic pounding of my heart through 1,000 desperate texts, and see the liquid grief of a woman who didn't know how to exist without his shadow. But as I stared at the glowing screen, I didn't feel the familiar sting of tears or the frantic urge to defend my worth. Instead, I felt a profound, almost clinical sense of detachment. This was the final data point I had been waiting for, the ultimate confirmation of the pattern I had been documenting in my secret journal. Marcus had finally shown his full hand, and it was as hollow as I had suspected. He was a man who thrived on supply. The emotional reactions, the pleading, and the desperate attempts of others to regain his favor. By sending such a brutal message, he was setting the stage for a performance he had directed a dozen times before. He expected the standard script of the discarded woman, the hundreds of missed calls, the why, and how could you, and the hysterical begging for a second chance. He needed that reaction to feel powerful, to feel that he was the sun, and I was merely a planet whose orbit had been violently disrupted. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let out a long, measured breath, and began to type. I didn't let my thumbs tremble. I didn't check for typos. I responded with a single 5-word sentence that I knew would be more damaging to his ego than 1,000 insults understood. Best of luck, Marcus. I hit send and set the phone back down on the counter. I could almost feel the silence echoing back from his end. In those 5 words, I had robbed him of the only thing he truly valued, my emotional labor. By refusing to play the part of the victim, I had effectively canceled his show. Without my reaction, his tests were meaningless. Without my pain, his power was an illusion. I knew Marcus well enough to know that my calm would be more unsettling to him than a scream. He had built his entire identity on being the one in control, the one who decided when a person was worthy, and I had just walked out of his courtroom without waiting for the verdict. The next 3 days were characterized by a strange, weightless departure. I began to pack my life into cardboard boxes, but I didn't feel like a woman being evicted from her home. I felt like a prisoner who had been sitting in a cell for years only to realize the gate had been left unlocked the entire time. Every book I tucked into a box and every piece of clothing I folded felt like a layer of Marcus's influence being peeled away. I moved through the house in a deliberate, quiet rhythm, choosing to leave behind anything that felt tainted by his marriage preparation tests. I left the expensive espresso machine he had used to critique my morning routine. I left the silk sheets he had used to measure my attentivity. As I cleared my things, the house began to feel cold and hollow, revealing itself as the sterile museum of Marcus's ego that it truly was. I wasn't losing a sanctuary. I was escaping a laboratory. While I worked in a serene silence, Marcus's world was beginning to experience the first tremors of a massive earthquake. My lack of response had clearly triggered a panic in him that he couldn't contain. He began to reach out to our mutual friends, to my colleagues, and even to my sister, subtly trying to plant the narrative that I had lost my mind, or that he was worried about my mental state following the breakup. It was a classic preemptive strike, an attempt to discredit the witness before she could testify. But what Marcus didn't account for was the professional network I had spent 30 years building. My friends didn't see a hysterical woman. They saw a respected educator who had quietly moved out and returned to her life with her dignity intact. By Thursday evening, as I loaded the last of my boxes into a van, Marcus's phone began to ring incessantly. The calls weren't coming from me. They were coming from his high-end tax clients, his partners at the firm, and members of our community who were starting to notice the glaring inconsistencies in the stories he was spinning. People were asking why a woman as stable and respected as Laura would suddenly snap without provocation. They were asking why he was so eager to trash the reputation of the woman he was supposed to marry in just a few months. My silence had created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, the noise of Marcus's own desperation was becoming deafening. He had tried to write the ending of my story, but he had forgotten that I was the one who taught people how to read between the lines. He thought I was the one being evicted, but he didn't realize that by ending it, he had just invited the world to audit his own lies. Settling into my new, smaller apartment, I felt a familiar sense of order returning to my life, a feeling akin to the first day of a new school semester after a chaotic summer. In the stillness, I began to reflect on Marcus not as a man I had loved, but as a behavioral problem I had finally solved. Over 30 years in the classroom, I had handled every type of problem student imaginable, from the overt bullies to the subtle, sophisticated manipulators who used blame shifting and triangulation to turn peers against one another. As I sat at my desk, I realized Marcus wasn't just a cruel man. He was a textbook case. He followed a systematic manual of manipulation I had once studied in a graduate psychology seminar on narcissism and control. The tests he subjected me to weren't signs of his high standards. They were the tactical maneuvers of a man who viewed interpersonal relationships as zero-sum games. By identifying the specific toxic framework he operated within, Marcus ceased to be a looming, intimidating fiancé and was transformed into a predictable subject. I began to see his outbursts and audits as the desperate tantrums of a student who had lost control of the classroom, and this intellectual distance gave me a layer of armor he could never pierce. The true breakthrough occurred as I was unpacking a stray crate of office supplies I had taken from the house and found a thin, leather-bound journal tucked at the bottom. It wasn't mine. It was Marcus's evaluation log, a document so chillingly precise it made my own mental notes look like casual observations. Inside, he had literally graded my reactions to his manufactured crises. He had marked me down for emotional volatility when I had questioned his disappearance at the gala, and given me a passing grade for silence when he criticized my cooking. It was a cold numerical record of his attempt to manufacture a submissive version of me. Instead of tearing the pages out or burning the book in a fit of rage, I reached for my teacher's red pen. With the practiced hand of a woman who had corrected thousands of essays, I began to leave corrections in the margins. I circled his logical fallacies, pointed out his lack of evidence for my supposed instability, and wrote, "See me after class," next to his most egregious attempts at gaslighting. This silent audit was my way of reclaiming the narrative. I wasn't a failing student in his life. He was an amateur playing at being a master, and I was finally returning his work with the failing grade it deserved. I knew that a man like Marcus thrived on the heat of conflict. He wanted me to call him to scream about the notebook to demand an explanation, so he could once again cast me as the hysterical ex, and himself as the suffering victim. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I chose a strategic retreat instead. I quietly withdrew my presence from every professional and social circle we shared, declining invitations to dinners and charity events without a word of explanation. I blocked his number not out of anger, but to stop being his emotional supply. By disappearing into a dignified silence, I created a profound feedback vacuum. Without me there to react, to soften his edges, or to translate his coldness into eccentricity for our friends, Marcus was left to stand on his own. His inconsistencies, previously masked by my attempts to keep the peace, began to bulge and crack in the public eye. His high-end tax clients and colleagues, who had always seen us as a package deal, were now forced to interact with the raw, unedited version of the man. Without my steadying hand, his arrogance began to bleed into his professional meetings, and the very people he sought to impress started to see the flickers of the man I had lived with. I didn't need to expose the truth. I just needed to stop being the one who helped him hide it. The vacuum I created by retreating into silence was soon filled by a voice I never expected to hear. 2 weeks after I had moved into my apartment, I received an email from a woman named Sarah. She was the someone else Marcus had referenced in his cold goodbye, the woman he had presented to the world as my younger, more compliant upgrade. But Sarah's message wasn't one of triumph or malice. It was a fractured plea for help. We met at a quiet tea house on the edge of town, and as I watched her sit down, I didn't see a rival. I saw a younger version of myself, her eyes darting nervously as she checked her phone, her hands trembling as she adjusted her scarf. She had been told I was an unstable, obsessed woman who refused to let go, but after only a few weeks of living with Marcus, she was already drowning in the same tests I had endured for years. Instead of feeding into the drama of the jealous ex, I spoke to her with the measured empathy of a mentor. I didn't disparage him. I simply opened my laptop and showed her a factual dated timeline of his behavioral patterns. I explained the gaslighting not as a personal failure on her part, but as a systematic cycle. Watching the blood drain from her face, I realized that the greatest blow I could deal to Marcus wasn't a public scandal, but the act of teaching his next victim how to read the syllabus before the first lesson was over. As we spoke, Sarah revealed a shocking detail that shifted the entire foundation of the story. She hadn't reached out to me solely because of her own doubts. She had been contacted in secret by Marcus's mother, Evelyn. Evelyn had lived a life of quiet desperation for decades, having survived the reign of Marcus's father, a man who had pioneered the very tests his son now used like a family inheritance. Evelyn had seen the headlines of our engagement and, recognizing the predatory patterns, had reached out to Sarah to warn her before she was too deeply entangled. Sarah pulled a thick envelope from her bag, a collection of letters and documents. Evelyn had kept records of the father's psychological abuse and evidence of Marcus's past relationships that ended in similar administrative dismissals. It was a legacy of broken women, a generational curse that Marcus was determined to continue. This was no longer just about my heartbreak. It had transformed into a powerful mission of female protection. We were two women from different generations linked by the same predator, now holding the evidence of a bloodline built on the systematic destruction of female self-worth. The most profound moment of our meeting came when I reached into my bag and pulled out Marcus's leather-bound evaluation log. I didn't tell Sarah what to do, nor did I offer a lecture on her worth. I simply slid the notebook across the table and watched her read the pages where Marcus had literally grated my soul. I showed her the red ink in the margins where I had corrected his logic and pointed out his manipulations. As Sarah saw my life mapped out as a set of scores, my grief quantified, my joy audited, she reached a point of no return. She saw her own future reflected in those cold numerical entries, realizing that in Marcus's eyes, she wasn't a partner or a lover. She was just the next student in a classroom she had never asked to join, destined to fail a curriculum designed for her defeat. The realization was visible in the way she straightened her back and finally put her phone face down on the table, silencing the frantic buzz of Marcus's latest check-in text. The alliance was sealed not in anger, but in the collective clarity of two women who refused to be subjects any longer. Sarah didn't ask me how to save the relationship. She asked me how I managed to get out alive. The question Sarah asked me at that tea house became the catalyst for a transformation I hadn't realized was possible, moving me from a silent observer to a woman ready to witness the natural consequences of a predator's own hubris. The following week provided the perfect stage for Marcus's inevitable unraveling. The annual Northeast Tax Professionals Symposium, a high-stakes gathering of the region's elite financial minds. Marcus was not just attending, he was the keynote speaker, a position he had spent years maneuvering to achieve. His lecture was titled Integrity in Finance, the Moral Audit of the Modern Consultant, a title so dripping with irony it made my stomach churn. Sarah and I arrived early, moving through the plush-carpeted hallways of the Grand Hotel with a shared silent purpose. We weren't there to cause a scene, to shout accusations, or to hand out flyers. We were there to apply the one pressure Marcus feared most, the unwavering gaze of those who truly knew him. We took our seats in the dead center of the front row, directly in his line of sight. When Marcus stepped onto the podium, the applause was thunderous, but as his eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto us, the confident smirk on his face flickered like a dying light bulb. He saw me, his discarded test subject, and Sarah, his intended upgrade, sitting side by side in a terrifying alliance of silence. We didn't move. We didn't whisper. We simply watched him with the calm, analytical detachment of two scientists observing a failing specimen. The first 10 minutes of his speech were a disaster of stumbles and forced pivots. Marcus, a man who prided himself on his eloquence and his ability to command a room, began to sweat under the collar of his expensive tailored suit. He kept losing his place in his notes, his eyes repeatedly darting back to our faces as if checking for a reaction that never came. He was a narcissist who required emotional feedback to maintain his mask. Without our anger or our tears to feed on, he was starving in front of an audience of 500 peers. He tried to lean into his usual persona of the intellectual authority, but the presence of the two women who had grated his soul was a psychological mirror he could not handle. The silence we offered him was a vacuum that sucked the air out of his lungs. He began to speed through his slides, his voice rising in pitch, becoming defensive against imagined slights. The audience began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the erratic energy radiating from the stage. A respected colleague from the third row stood up during the mid-lecture Q&A to ask a standard technical question about fiduciary duty and client trust. But Marcus, now fully in the grip of a psychological glitch, didn't hear a question about taxes. He heard a challenge to his power. In a desperate, frantic attempt to reassert his dominance and prove that he was still the one in control, Marcus did the unthinkable. He abandoned his prepared remarks and began to vent his words, sharpened by the same cruelty he had used on me in private. To belittle the man who had asked the question, Marcus reached into his mental files and pulled out a specific, highly confidential case study to prove his point. In his arrogance and his need to humiliate an opponent, he began to recite the private financial details and offshore holdings of one of the firm's most prominent clients, a high-profile political donor whose anonymity was protected by layers of legal ironclad. It was a massive, irrevocable violation of U.S. tax privacy laws and the fundamental ethics of his license. The room went deathly silent. It wasn't the silence of respect, but the horrified hush of professionals witnessing a career suicide in real time. Marcus continued for several seconds, his face flushed with a dark, triumphant heat, before he realized the magnitude of what he had just uttered into a recorded microphone. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated, revealing the true ugly nature of a man who would burn everything down just to feel superior for a single moment. The fallout was instantaneous and clinical. The symposium's board members moved to the side of the stage, their faces grim as they whispered into headsets. Because Marcus had made this disclosure at a public recorded event, the report wasn't just a matter of internal discipline. It was a mandatory referral to the IRS and the state licensing board. In the weeks that followed, the audit Marcus had so often threatened me with finally came for him. The investigation into his professional conduct uncovered more than just the public slip. It revealed a pattern of fraudulent tests he had been performing on client accounts moving funds without authorization to see how long it took for them to notice a mirror of the psychological games he played in his bedroom. He had been treating the Internal Revenue Code with the same narcissistic disregard he had shown for my heart. He didn't just lose his keynote status. He lost his license, his partnership, and the carefully curated reputation that was the only thing he truly loved. I watched the news of his professional death from the quiet of my new home, feeling no need to celebrate. He hadn't been destroyed by a vengeful ex-fiancé. He had been destroyed by the weight of his own performing ego. He simply couldn't stop playing the master even when the world was watching him fail. The final moment of his public life occurred as he was being escorted from the hotel by the event's security and a legal representative from his firm. The hallway was lined with his former peers, people who had once looked up to him now turning their backs in a collective wave of disgust. As Marcus was led past the spot where Sarah and I stood, his bravado finally failed him. He looked aged, his suit rumpled the sharp lines of his face, sagging under the reality of his total displacement. For a split second, his eyes met mine, and I saw a flash of the terrified small boy beneath the predator's armor. He wasn't looking for a fight anymore. He was looking for the one person who had always been there to catch him, the woman who had spent years absorbing his blows and fixing his messes. He looked at me with a silent, pathetic plea for help, as if expecting me to step in and grade his failure on a curve one last time. But the teacher had left the room. As the security led him away from the podium, he looked at me for help, but for the first time, I wasn't there to give him the answer. The silence that followed Marcus's public downfall was not empty. It was a vast, peaceful meadow after a lifetime of navigating a minefield. A few weeks after the symposium, as the legal dust began to settle on his ruined career, I sat in my new living room with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of violet and gold. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a notification for a voicemail from a blocked number. I knew before I even pressed play that it was him. Marcus's voice was unrecognizable, thin, ragged, and stripped of the clinical arrogance that had once defined him. It was a long, rambling message, a desperate plea for a second chance that veered wildly between self-pity and misplaced nostalgia. He spoke of his childhood, blaming the cold, calculating nature of his father for the man he had become, attempting to use his own trauma as a final test of my compassion. He begged me to remember the good times, though the more I searched my memory, the more I realized those good times were simply the brief interludes between his psychological strikes. I listened to the entire message once, and to my surprise, I felt no surge of anger, no desire for a cutting rebuttal, and certainly no urge to rescue him. I felt only a profound sense of closure, the kind that comes when you finally understand that a person isn't a puzzle to be solved, but a book you've finished reading and have no intention of opening again. I realized that responding even to express my disdain would be a mistake. It would be handing him the emotional supply he so desperately craved, restarting a toxic cycle I had worked so hard to break. With a steady hand and a light heart, I pressed the delete button, watching the message vanish into the digital ether. It was the final act of my own audit. I had found his pleas to be of no value, and I had simply written them off. Returning to my classroom the following Monday felt like stepping back into my true skin. The students noticed the change in me immediately. There was a renewed sense of authority in my voice, a clarity in my eyes that hadn't been there when I was distracted by Marcus's manufactured crises. During a lesson on Arthur Miller's The Crucible, we began discussing the concept of integrity and the high price of maintaining one's soul in a world of manipulation. One of my seniors, a bright girl who reminded me far too much of my younger self, asked why some characters allowed themselves to be tested by people who clearly didn't love them. I looked at her, and for a moment I wasn't just a teacher. I was a survivor sharing a hard-won truth. I explained that in life, just as in literature, we often mistake endurance for strength. I told the class that love is not a series of hurdles you must jump over to prove your worth, nor is it a laboratory where your resilience is measured against someone else's cruelty. I shared a subtle, powerful lesson about the difference between patience and enabling. Patience is waiting for a flower to bloom. Enabling is standing still while someone pulls your petals off one by one to see how much you can take before you wither. I told them that the most important lesson they would ever learn isn't found in a textbook, but in the power of walking away from any test that requires them to diminish themselves to pass. The silence in the classroom was heavy with understanding, and in that moment, I realized that my ordeal with Marcus had given me a new, profound purpose to be the teacher who ensures no one else has to learn those lessons the way I did. My ultimate victory didn't come in the form of a new relationship or a grand public vindication beyond what had already occurred. It was much quieter and more permanent than that. It was the realization that I had moved from being the subject of Marcus's distorted experiments to being the sole architect of my own life. I spent my weekends visiting galleries, walking through the woods, and reconnecting with friends I had pushed away during my years of marriage preparation. I reclaimed the parts of myself Marcus had audited out of existence, my love for adventurous cooking, my penchant for loud laughter, and my unwavering belief in my own intellect. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was 52 years old and finally truly free. My peace was the ultimate revenge against a man who had tried to convince me that I was a failing student who would be nothing without his guidance. Marcus had lost his license, his reputation, and his power, but I had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that my worth was never his to grade. I had audited my own life, cleared away the toxic debt of his influence, and found that my balance was not just positive, it was overflowing. The classroom of my life was finally under my control, and the syllabus was written in my own hand. The lessons I've learned aren't just for my students. They are for every woman who has ever felt her confidence eroding under the constructive criticism of someone who claims to love her. We are taught to be peacemakers, to be resilient, and to be the ones who hold everything together, but we are rarely taught that some things are meant to fall apart. Marcus's biggest mistake was assuming that his tests were the only ones that mattered. He didn't realize that while he was testing my loyalty, I was testing his humanity, and he was the one who failed. I now walk through my days with a sense of calm that is unshakable because I know that I will never again allow another person to hold the red pen to my life. I have realized that the only person who gets to decide if I've passed or failed is the woman staring back at me in the mirror. Freedom isn't just the absence of Marcus, it's the presence of myself. And so, as I close this chapter and look toward a future that belongs entirely to me, I leave you with one final thought to carry into your own journey. If someone keeps testing your worth, ask yourself, what are they afraid you'll realize once the test finally ends? Thank you for following Laura's journey from being a subject in a cruel experiment to becoming the architect of her own freedom. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is never up for debate and certainly not subject to someone else's distorted grading system. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own strength, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community. We are dedicated to sharing stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of women who refuse to be broken. Your support helps us continue to bring these narratives to light. We also want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever encountered someone who tried to test your loyalty or your worth under the guise of love? How did you find the strength to walk away, or what advice would you give to someone currently caught in that cycle? We believe that the wisdom of our audience is one of our greatest strengths, and your insights might be the exact words someone else needs to hear today to find their own path to clarity. Let's continue this conversation and support one another in recognizing that love should be a sanctuary, not a laboratory. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story of empowerment and transformation. Thank you for watching and for being a part of this journey with us.